Victor senses this one has not been spared.
There's no question in my mind that the grave had been disturbed. The timbers covering the roof of the grave were inverted from their normal position. There were no reeds or branches or other materials to cover over the grave that would prevent the sand from falling down into the chamber.
The grave goods which should be down at the level that the back or the side is, the lowest point is where the grave goods should be. We're not quite down to that point yet. I can't tell what this is over here, Charlotte. Can you tell in this corner here? Is that a pelvis or is it...
There's been some disturbance in the bottom.
It's been disturbed, right.
There's something else coming out there as he's brushing.
Normally we would see the skull or the head before we see the chest because the head is higher, thicker, and we would see that. And so far we've seen a chest and a hand that I've seen. Charlotte may
and a
see
bit of a forearm and part of a leg. But that's about all we can see at the moment.
This is a piece of textile, but it's not a woven piece. It's done in a different technique that's sort of like a braid. And it probably was a piece of, like a piece of belting used on some part of their clothing. It feels like wool. Oh, yeah, this is wool that's been spun. Sheep wool, spun into yarn. And let's see, is it woven? No, there's no weaving on it yet. It's just twisted.
For a moment, a scrap of wool distracts the visitors. But Victor suspects something is amiss.
Peering down into the grave, I saw fungal growth on the corpse, which would indicate that it had probably previously been located elsewhere than in that grave. And the fact that the corpse itself was quite well preserved, but it was headless, is inexplicable unless there was disturbance.
It seems the Chinese had planted a headless body here to avoid the risk of unearthing a European typeface. They may not have anticipated that the visitors would explore other avenues in their search for clues to the origins of the mummy people. Victor, once again, has unearthed a major find without having to dig at all. In an obscure local museum, he finds two mummies from the cemetery. An adult man and a girl, surrounded by objects from her grave.
She's quite young, and from what I can see, looking at the edge of the pelvis, there's a bit there that usually fuses around the age of 25, and that certainly hasn't fused. So she's probably around 18 to 20 years of age. If you look at her face, she's got a pretty flat face and high cheekbones, a short nose which isn't very protruding. And she looks very similar to people who live in this area today, although we notice she's got an overbite. If you look at the teeth, you see the teeth. Yeah. Usually many people in this area have an edge-to-edge bite, and she has got an overbite,
so
which tends to be more European in nature. We've got some preservation of hair here, and look at the fingernails. You see them? They're quite long and don't look like they've been cut for a long time. Interestingly, this young person looks like she's quite emaciated. Now that might be something to do with the mummification processes, desiccating the skin, but maybe she was ill for a long time. But certainly there's no evidence to suggest by just looking here what caused her death.
She has very little flesh. Her fingers are very skinny.
Beside the girl is a water bucket.
And then on top of it is a piece of bread. And this whole apparatus, including the halter for the donkey, which lies beside her, indicates that they placed things in the burial for her trip to the next world or to use in the afterworld, which were very important, like the bucket which held a liquid, the bread, and the bridle for transportation.
The male body, which was discovered in the late 70s, is faring far worse than it would buried in sand. The curators lack the funds to prevent the gradual disintegration of some of the most important human remains ever found. But this ancient man can still offer precious clues about his people. An oval face and reddish hair suggest European roots. His bronze earring and leather boots show his people were skilled artisans.
They were buried wearing their clothing. They wore boots with felt stockings, kaftans, trousers. So we know what they would have looked like when they were walking around and alive.
The objects they cherished in death begin to create a picture of the mummy people's lives. They were farmers who kept domestic animals and worked a land thousands of miles away from their ancestral turf.
This is a food item for the local people, and it's made from barley, and they came in many different shapes.
So it's in fact bread.
Bread of some sort. And you'll notice the curvature on this piece of bread.
这是呢是一件丝竹木盘，这个呢我们也是在墓葬里头发现了。
A wooden basin with legs on the bottom.
它是一种盛器，就是生活用具。
It's a vessel for daily use.
Yes, it's a vessel for daily use, but it's also placed in the burial and could have held bits of food or intended to hold food for use in their next world also.
Noted archaeologist Wang Bin-he found further evidence.
We even found some farming tools. The woolen and leather clothing came mainly from sheep, so they must have had quite large flocks. Handicrafts were also well developed. For example, they could make clay pots.
This was probably used by the priestess or the shamanka, the female priestess, to cure people. There's still evidence this is very possibly a little cultic cup made from clay, fired very nicely, and it has an extremely thin. When we have this
expanding spiral,
this spiral, right? This is very typical of nomadic people also.
Hard to believe it's 3,200 years old.
Cowrie shells from the sea, not naturally found within thousands of miles of this vast desert, give up a crucial piece of the puzzle.
They must have been engaged in long-distance trade, because we see in their graves sometimes things like cowries. They would have had to acquire such things from distant peoples.
These are actually the spindles, and this is the spindle whorl. This one is made out of wood, while this one is made out of bone. And they're different weights, so they would be used to spin different weight of rolled yarn.
Of all the finds here, the woolen textiles are the most impressive. Woven into twill and tartan patterns, these are among the oldest fine woolen clothes ever discovered.
This one has beautiful and harmonious colors. It has blue, white, and red. Also, the design and weaving is so wonderful. This piece is 3,000 years old.
Strikingly similar to Celtic tartans from northwest Europe, the patterns in the weave are like ancient DNA, waiting to be decoded. Are they evidence that the mummy people share common origins with the people of Western Europe? Scientific reconstruction of the heads of the mummies produces a face that strongly resembles ancient Celts and Saxons. The mummy people buried their dead in the barren desert, but lived in the oases along its edges. These islands of green are still home to farmers who have little contact with the outside world and use tools and methods that have barely changed over the centuries. Could their way of life harbor its own living relics? Fragments of an ancient time preserved like the mummies themselves. The team sets out to explore a nearby village. Charlotte wants to find out about patterns of health and nutrition, since those leave indelible marks on corpses and skeletons.
Are there any problems, general health problems? Is there any dental disease?
Problems that afflict present-day locals might explain defects found on the mummies and shed light on their way of life.
Colds and flus and just general minor illnesses, but nothing major. Yeah, no. But you can see, like the one woman, she has a thyroid condition.
Yes, I wondered if there was an iodine deficiency in the water.
It turns out the local people enjoy good health, sustained by a balanced diet of cereals, fruit, vegetables, and meat from their livestock. But the condition of the livestock itself prompts an important insight about the past.
Looking at the animals today, their wool is very, very poor quality. And in contrast, the textiles that we found in the burials are made from very, very fine quality wool. So that would indicate to me that they had trade with nomadic people who were living in the Tian Shan, who were in an environment that would produce a very fine quality wool.
Today's farmers do in fact buy wool, meat, and timber from herders who live high in the mountains. Could this pattern date back to the mummy people?
I believe that the mummy people must have had similar contact with ancient nomadic herders to weave such fine textiles.
There's a lot about this cart that looks like very ancient remains that we found.
The ways of the living echo those of the past. The mummy people, like the people of the Russian steppes to the north and the west, used donkey carts similar to those found here today.
There's a piece of wood in one of the burials. It's almost identical with these pieces here.
The changeless nature of their design is revealed by these artifacts found in their graves. The mummy people used the wheel long before it was known in China, and may have played a role in introducing it to Chinese civilization. In another reflection of the past, fir trees from the Tian Shan Mountains are used to fashion vessels and boards, like those the local women use for bread making.
When we were working at Wupu at the graveyard, we found a similar bowl, smaller in size, but made with the identical techniques.
Even the curved bread resembles the ancient loaf, similarly baked on the oven wall.
In some ways, when you go into the modern village of Wupu, you feel like you're entering into the ancient period in which when you look at the artifacts, you feel like you're recapitulating that. There's so many similarities.
But the scholars need to set their gaze beyond the village to explore the interdependence of local farmers and mounted nomadic herdsmen. After centuries of self-sufficiency, the mummy people grew increasingly reliant on goods provided by nomads, who found in the higher reaches of the Tian Shan Mountains pastures rich enough to raise high-quality livestock. Until recently, this area was off-limits to foreigners, and the visitors were not prepared for what they saw.
Much to our utter surprise, we found magnificent grasslands that are so immense it boggles the mind, and they go very high.